All right, so now we're going to move into Judges chapter 16. And this is, of course, probably the most famous segment of Samson's whole story, right? I mean, usually Samson's story, we kind of just, whenever you share it or you talk about it, you kind of just hit the highlights, like, okay, he fought the 1,000 people with a donkey's jawbone. That's one of those things that people talk about. And so far, that's been kind of the big thing that we've talked about so far. If you remember, that's actually how chapter 15 ended. And up until this point, up until the beginning of 16, right? It wasn't really, up until the end of 15, it still really wasn't known who Samson was, right? As far as the Philistines were concerned, he was just another Hebrew. No one really understood who he was or how God was going to use them until suddenly they went up against him, and through the might of God, God allowed him to slay an army of Philistines by himself. So now he has been established. Now they know just who it is that they are up against. And as we read at the end of chapter 15, it says, Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And so it seems, as we read this last story, we know that this last story kind of happens rather quickly. So this must have been in the 20th year, I would assume. So he has this long reign as a judge, as a leader of Israel, and suddenly it comes to this point where it says, one day Samson went down, and this is once again another great highlight of why even the judges are all imperfect people. One day Samson went to Gaza, where he saw a prostitute, and he went in to spend the night with her. And the people of Gaza were told, Samson is here. So they surrounded the place and lay wait for him all night at the city gate. They made no move during the night, saying, at dawn, we'll kill him. Which I always find weird. Why would you wait until dawn when he's fully refreshed and awake? Yes, I am ready for the day. Now I can fight. Why would you wait that long? It would make more sense to go against him in the night, but for whatever reason they didn't. And of course, there's the elephant in the room that you can't ignore. Wait a minute, if he was a man of God and he was supposed to be doing godly things, then why did he go visit a prostitute? Well, as you remember, I went through the Philistine vow with you before. And the reason I went through the Philistine vow with you before is because he wasn't even keeping that all that well, right? He wasn't even supposed to be anywhere near a dead body. Well, I'm not sure if you... Sorry? Oh, sorry, Nazirite vow, not Philistine vow. Thank you. Yes, did not mean Philistine vow. The Nazirite vow, where was I? He wasn't even keeping that well because, if you slay an army of 1,000 people, you're going to be near a lot of dead bodies, right? It's just, it's going to happen. So, obviously, there's nothing written down here that tells us that he partook of any grapes or anything like that, but we know he kept going to these. Well, he had his own wedding, and it certainly would have been custom there. We don't know that he did. But then, of course, there comes this last part, and it seems that he kept the last part of the vow very, very devoutly, which was his hair. Right? He never brought any razor against his hair. And we're going to read about that later because he actually kept his hair braided, which makes sense. If you're going to have really long hair, makes sense at least keep it under some semblance of control so it's not always getting in your way. But he seems to have kept his hair braided. All that to say, right, he wasn't very good at keeping this vow. Why? Because he was a human. Right? He wasn't some extraordinary Superman. He was just a man who God used to do extraordinary things. But it was by the power of God, not by the power of Samson. This is important for us to remember because sometimes we slot ourselves into these kinds of slots as well, right? We say to ourselves, well, I've done a bad thing. How many of you ever felt like that? I've done a bad thing. How could God ever use me? I know I've felt that way before. You do something, you go, and you really, because, let's face it, we are our own worst enemy. And our own negativity is the thing that chews us up the most. Because we're the one that can see ourselves really clear, right? We know what we look like, warts and all, because we know what happens when no one else is around us. But I think it's important to point out here that Samson wasn't perfect either. Samson had a lot of issues. Samson, in fact, sinned. But God still uses him to do amazing things. Anyway, so they're waiting during the night, and they said, at dawn we'll kill him. Verse 3, but then Samson lay there only until the middle of the night, and then he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with 2 posts, tore them loose, bar and all, and he lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Okay, so if you don't know, Hebron becomes the first capital city of Israel. So there is some significance to the fact that Hebron is where he faced the gates. But also, this is one of the stranger things that I've heard. There's been people trying to rationalize like how great of a feat this is by saying, well, when we think city gates, we think a giant walled city like how Jerusalem was with those monstrous gates. And that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about something little bigger than a door. And I kept thinking to myself as I heard these people trying to rationalize this away, if I stood there and reefed on that door all day long, there is no way I'm getting the door off, let alone the door and the hinges and the doorpost. Okay? It doesn't really matter to me how big the gate was. The fact is, even if it was a small gate, this is an incredible feat. This is what it's trying to set the pace for. It's trying to show you he is stronger than anything we've ever seen before or since. And then it says sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Key thing, he fell in love. Did she? Nope. That's a warning to all the single fellas. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, see if you can lure him into showing you what the secret of his great strength is, of his great strength, and how we can overpower him so that we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. So 1,100 shekels is roughly 28 pounds, and it doesn't tell us how many liters there were. We can clearly assume there was more than one. So at minimum, 56 pounds of silver. I don't know about you. That sounds like a pretty solid retirement plan right there. Not to mention, it was probably more. But Samson here, of course, he had a big disadvantage that each and every one of us has a warning for. And so I want us to look really quickly. I'm going to flip us over to the book of Proverbs, because the book of Proverbs obviously came way after the time of Samson. And in Proverbs chapter 5, we're going to read 1-6 and then 7:21-23. So chapter 5, 1-6, it says, my son, be attentive to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may keep discretion, and your lips may guard knowledge, for the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps follow the path to Sheol, and she does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. And then real quickly, over to chapter 7, verse 21-23. It's following in the same stream. Solomon had a lot to say about sexual impropriety. Chapter 7, 21. With much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast, till an arrow pierces its liver. As a bird rushes into a snare, he does not know it will cost him his life. We have the benefit of being able to read this wisdom that was passed down from Solomon. And many of us, we read this and we go, yeah, I get it. No, it makes sense. This is a trap, right? The comparison to a snare totally makes sense. It is a trap, and it is a trap that so many young men especially fall for. Why? Well, because they are just singularly motivated, aren't they? And unfortunately, that's exactly where Samson is in his life. At the end of the day, he may be a great man. He may be a great man that God is using to do amazing things. But at the end of the day, he is still a man. And if you remember, he is now a single man because his wife went up in flames. So we come back to the book of Judges, and it says in verse 6, "So Delilah said to Samson, 'Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued.'" Now, this is the danger and why I pointed out. Wait, was she in love with him? Because, guys, sometimes you fall head over heels for a lady, and many of you fellas that have been married for a while can think back to your dating days and go, "Oh, yeah, I remember. Yep. I spent way too much money on that lad, or that lass." Because this should be a red flag. Why does she want to know what your great weakness is? Right? This is a red flag. And this goes for women too. If a man, you're dating a guy, and a guy looks at you and says, "What is your great weakness?" It's not a good start to a relationship. Remember, they're not married. Samson answered her, and of course he gives her an answer, but of course it's nonsense. "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Again, this is meant to demonstrate how powerful Samson is when the Lord is with him. Think about that. I've seen a string next to a flame. It goes, there's zero effort put into it. It's just, you put it in the air, it goes up, and it's snapped. That's it. It's done. With almost no effort, Samson snapped. Now, I don't know about you. I've never been able to snap a bowstring. Never. Let alone a fresh one. Where was I? Oh, 10. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." Another red flag. Why are you so desperate, Delilah, to tie me up? So he said, "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." But of course, if we reflect back to chapter 15, we remember, wait, didn't they do this already? Didn't they use brand new ropes that have never been used, and then he broke them as easily as charred flax? But either way, Delilah doesn't know the story. Delilah doesn't know what happened. So Delilah takes the new ropes and tied him with them. Then, with men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the ropes off his arms snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Delilah then said to Samson, "All this time you've been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." Another red flag. When they start bringing in the guilt trip, red flag. So, of course, he replies, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head," right? Kept his hair braided. Makes sense. You don't want it just flying everywhere. "7 braids of my head into the fabric of the loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." I mean, that's a strange one. Right? Can we admit that one seems weird? I don't know why she thought this, but she did it anyway. So while he was sleeping, Delilah took the 7 braids of his head, wove them into the fabric, and tightened it with a pin. Again, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And he awoke from sleep and pulled up the pin and the loom with the fabric. And she said to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. And what was that? Oh, it was the bag. So he told her everything. Big mistake. No razor has ever been used on my head, he said, because come on. She's already tried to restrain him 3 times. But this is what I'm trying to get at, okay? And it's why I went to the book of Proverbs, okay? The reason that warning is there is because it's true. Men get dumb around a pretty face. It just happens. That's why marriage is such a good thing for men, because it helps us go, wait a minute, no, I gotta wait. I gotta stay over here. You're a problem. I've been a Nazarite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb, and if my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. Now, I'm going to pause there, and I want to really reiterate that point again, because I think it's really worth us not going past, because so often, so many times, I know I've even done it myself when I've talked about this story, we say, Samson was dedicated from the point of birth until death, but that's not what the scripture says. It says from the womb. And this is important for us to recognize today, because unfortunately it is becoming an issue inside the church, that we don't recognize the sanctity of life from the womb. Verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent the word to the rulers of the Philistines, come back once more, he told me everything. So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. And after putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him. They gouged out his eyes, and they took him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze shackles, and they set him to grinding grain in the prison. So the gouging out of the eyes was an act of humiliation. You'll see if you go back through the Pentateuch, right, the first 5 books of the Bible, if you go through Joshua and Judges, you'll see that this was actually a very common practice that you would do to your enemies. You would gouge out their eyes because then suddenly they were useless. Quite frankly, we get to live in the 21st century today. If you're blind today, you have quite a few options to you. If you were blind back in Samson's day, you better hope that you got some very generous friends, because otherwise you're dead. The other thing that happened too, what did they bind him with? Bronze shackles. I think this is an important detail, because what the Philistines are famous for is that when they arrived in Israel had bronze. Bronze is an alloy, if you don't know. Of copper and brass? Someone said yes. I couldn't remember. Copper and brass. But the problem with bronze is that it's actually kind of soft. It's not that great. In fact, that's why when the Philistines came, one of the reasons that they had such an easy time conquering and taking over a lot of areas is because they were fighting with iron. And we still use iron today. Like, iron is a very hard, very dependable metal. Yes, it is a bit more brittle. That's why steel eventually has basically replaced it. But iron was much, much stronger. And of course, if they wanted to imprison Samson, this great and mighty man, and they wanted to make sure that he was imprisoned to the highest degree, they would have used iron, but they didn't use bronze. It showed that they thought of him as weak once again. And of course, they sent him to grinding grain, which again, I think we've talked about this before, like the method of grinding grain back in those days was very labor intensive. You didn't have windmills yet, so you had to actually manually move the millstone back and forth over the path of grain. It was hard labor. And of course, something that he could still do despite not having any eyes. But Samuel reminds us the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, and there's a fairly famous quote by a well-known preacher. His name is Charles Spurgeon from the 19th century. And he asked a very good question. Why did they let it grow back? If they believed that the source of his strength was his hair, why weren't they sending a barber down there every day to make sure his head was bald every single day? But of course they didn't, and so now instead the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, who is their god, to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." Which of course, that's what you would think, right? We've been coming up against this God of the Hebrews, and now look, our God has overcome. Our God has vanquished our enemy. Look what we have done. He has given their greatest warrior into our hands. And when the people saw him, verse 24, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste to our land, who multiplied our slain." And while their spirits were high in this celebration, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." And so they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. Now, what he performed, I don't know. I imagine just his presence being there, standing, right? The mockery that he would have had to endure. But when they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." And now the temple was crowded with men and women. As you can imagine, this is a great victory. It would have been a huge celebration. It would have been people from all over Gaza would have arrived. And it says, on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. And then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me, please God, strengthen me just one more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all of his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all of the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Before we get to the conclusion, it says 3,000 were on the roof. That doesn't include anyone that was in any other part of the temple. Okay, because that's often the figure that we refer to, 3,000, but no, we're talking like this was a massive group of people that just got slain. Then his brothers and his father and his whole family went down to get him and brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtal in the tomb of Manoah, his father. He had led Israel for 20 years. Last point before we wrap up. His brothers went and got him. Remember the story about Manoah and his wife? They couldn't have kids. Samson was the first. So this says to me, as a reward for their steadfast faithfulness and their constant serving of the Lord, not just as what happened with in many other situations where we read in the Bible, when God opened her womb, he opened it forever to allow her to continue to have more children. And she did. And she did. She continued to have more children. Their name was able to live on, and they were able to continue to represent their father's name. Samson's line didn't end with Samson, but it lived on through his brothers. And the faithfulness of 2 people, Manoah and his wife, ended up leading to this great event that ended up liberating them from Philistine oppression for many years. Now the sad part is that this is the last of the good judges that we're going to read about. If you'll notice, there's still a few chapters left. Unfortunately, this is the last of the good judges. That's just the way it is. But what I love about the story of Samson is that it showed mistakes, it showed punishment, but it also showed redemption. That he was able to be redeemed. He was able to continue to be used by God, even when he broke his vow, even when he allowed himself, despite all of the red flags, to be fooled into doing something so foolish. God was still willing to use him to accomplish something that no one else could have done. I love the story of Samson because it reminds me that it doesn't matter where I'm at in my life or anything like that. That as long as I'm willing to serve the Lord, even if I've made mistakes in my past, God can and will use me.